Dean, if you want to use it, just press the start button.
Good start.
Okay. So, yeah, my name is Kevin. I recently graduated from McGill University. I graduated with a biology degree and a cognitive science degree. And you guys might be wondering what cognitive science is. It's actually the integration between several disciplines that involves intelligence. So that includes philosophy, linguistics, neuroscience, psychology, computer science. And what I want to do today with you guys is to give you a little bit about what I did, to tell you a little bit about what I did with philosophy. And more specifically, I'm going to give you a couple of tips to critiquing a philosophical argument. So before I do that, I would just like to give you guys a little flavor of what philosophy is. And philosophy is really the investigation of everything. It encompasses everything in our world, from the tangible to the abstract. There are often notions about philosophy that it's obscure, it's vague, that it's subjective. They're actually gross misconceptions. Philosophy is really nothing like that. Philosophy relies heavily on our general human intuitions and sentiments. And the questions the philosophers ask are often very, very familiar to all of us. And odds are you have thought about some of these questions at one point or another of your life. And lastly, other than the investigatory nature of the different disciplines of philosophy, what binds these different disciplines of philosophy together is the power of universal and invariable logic. So philosophers spend a lot of their time tearing apart the argument of other philosophers. So in my introduction, what I want to do is to give you a quick guide to how to critique a philosophical argument. I'll be providing you guys with examples from history of philosophy, and these are really what the arguments philosophers have come up with. So what I need from you guys is for you guys to use your logic and tell me how these examples are wrong. And hopefully by the end, you'll be able to differentiate a sound argument from a valid argument, from an invalid argument, and a good argument from a bad argument. So as I mentioned earlier, philosophy is all about the logic. And by logic, I don't mean anything special, anything esoteric to the philosophers, but really the general knowledge that all human beings have, or at least the sensible ones. And arguments always follow in this order. You have the different premises, and I'll just label them P1, P2, P3, and that will give you to your conclusion. And in a philosophy argument such as this, if the logic is correct, we say that this argument is valid. And if the logic is incorrect, we say that it's invalid. But more technically, we say that an argument is valid when, if you assume all the premises to be true, the conclusion is necessarily true. And it's invalid when the truth values of the premises does not guarantee the truth value of the conclusion. And what that means is just, if you assume all the premises to be true, the conclusion is not necessarily true. But even when you have impeccable logic, it doesn't mean your conclusion will be a proper and a sensible conclusion. And the reason for that is one of your premises, or several of them, could be false in themselves. And in that case, we call those arguments unsound arguments. And in arguments where the logic is great, that is, it's valid, and the conclusion is right, we say those arguments are sound arguments. So here are several examples. They're not really philosophical arguments, they're just arguments to illustrate the different kind of arguments, valid, invalid, sound, unsound arguments. So I would like you guys to differentiate if these arguments are valid or invalid, and if they're valid, that they're sound or unsound. So the first one, if it's raining, then John has an umbrella. It's raining, therefore John has an umbrella. Who thinks it's valid? Come on, be brave, you should all know this. Okay, great, most of you think it's valid, and yes, it is valid. Now the next question is it sound? Yes, it is sound. We'll give it a big tick. Now the second one. If it's raining, then the sky is pink. It's raining outside. Therefore, the sky is pink. Is it valid? Yes, it is valid. Valid. But is it sound? No, it's not sound because the sky is not pink. Not sound. How about the last one? If it's raining, then John has an umbrella. John has an umbrella. Therefore, it's raining. Is it valid? No, it's not valid. Very good. So when a philosopher divides an argument, they believe they have devised not only a valid argument, but also a sound argument. But that's really not always the case, because the arguments can often be unsound, like this one, or they could often be invalid. I mean, that might be very difficult to imagine, because you think, well, they're philosophers, they must be right. But no, 98% of the time they're not. So, I will now give you a few strategies to critique the philosophical argument. And the first thing you want to do is you want to look at the argument. You want to point out the conclusion, and you want to see if you agree or disagree with the conclusion. And if you agree with the conclusion, well, there's not much for you to do, because if you disprove the thing, you just disprove something you agree with. But if you disagree, it's much more interesting. So there's several ways you can disprove the argument. The first way is for you to disprove the conclusion. The second way is for you to disprove one of the premises. And the third way is to point out the logical fallacy of the argument. So I'll begin by disproving the conclusion. Actually, I can erase this now. C for conclusion. The first strategy you should take is you want to point out something that is included by the conclusion, but it shouldn't be, and something that is excluded by the conclusion, but it should be. So in another sense, you want to point out the exceptions to conclusion, and if you can point out just one exception, that's enough to break down the whole argument. So the first thing, one, is exceptions. And so I'm going to give you an example of this, and hopefully you guys can give me exception to it. So this is one of the conclusions people have in the field of philosophy of language. All communicatory behaviors are languages. Do we agree with it? Some people are nodding, some people are shaking their head. Or if you don't agree with it, give me an exception. All communicatory behaviors are languages. Animals. You know, the monkeys, I believe, or cats, they have these different hand signals, one for the enemies coming, one for like sharing food. But these are communicatory behaviors, but we don't think they're languages. So if someone said that to you, you give an exception, you have to disprove the conclusion, and you have to disprove the argument. And the second strategy is for you to point out a problematic implication of the conclusion. It's harder to explain what that means, but I'll just give you an example of it. This is from philosophy of mathematics. So in philosophy of mathematics, some people believe in the view that mathematics is not a part of this world. It's not something real. It's not a part of nature. But it's a product of human imagination and intelligence. Do people understand what that means? Sort of? Or what it's really trying to say is things like numbers, mathematical entities like square, pi, all these things. They're really not a part of this world. Like, there's nothing in nature that's a square. It's never, because a square is perfect four-sided, you can never find a perfect square. So what we mean by a square, a triangle, all these numbers is just a way for us to describe the world, but there's really nothing out there. It's a representation that humans have for the world, but it's not in the world.